The soldering iron never lied. Marcus Hale had learned that lesson 23 years ago, crouched inside the engine compartment of a Meridian-class warship while plasma fire stitched the hull above him. Lie to your commanding officer. Lie to your enemy. Lie to yourself if you had to, but never lie to the work. The work always knew. He turned the soldering iron in a slow, practiced arc along the cracked coupling of a water filtration unit, and the metal responded the way good metal always did, and with a quiet, honest hiss. A bead of solder followed the seam like a tiny silver river finding its path home. There. Done. He set the iron down, rolled his shoulders until something popped, and reached for his coffee. Cold. He drank it anyway. Cold coffee was still coffee. And on Drifton Station, you didn't waste things. Drifton Station hung in low orbit above the gas giant Ural 4 like a piece of debris that had given up falling. It had been a refueling depot once, then a mining coordination hub, then a refugee processing center, and finally, when every government and corporation had finished squeezing it for whatever value remained, it had become what it was now. A place where things ended up when nowhere else would have them. That included Marcus. He was 51 years old, broad through the shoulders, narrow through the patience. His hair had gone gray at the temples a decade ago and kept going, the way things on Drifton kept going, slowly, stubbornly, without permission. He had a mechanic's hands, the knuckles large and scarred, the fingertips calloused into something close to armor. He had eyes the color of old iron, steady and difficult to read, the kind of eyes that had looked at a great many dangerous things and decided on each occasion not to blink. His workshop occupied the corner of Level 7 where 3 corridors met at an angle that made no geometric sense. The station's original architects had clearly run out of both material and ambition at that particular junction, and what they'd left behind was a triangular space large enough for a workbench, 3 shelving units, a cot, a coffee station, and exactly enough room to turn around without knocking anything over. If you were careful, and Marcus was always careful. A hand-painted sign hung above the entrance. Crooked, because the wall wasn't straight. Second chances repair. We fix everything. First cup of coffee is free. Below the sign, someone had painted a symbol he didn't recognize. 2 overlapping triangles point to point, forming a rough diamond. Shape. He'd noticed it about 6 months ago. He kept meaning to ask someone what it meant. He kept forgetting. He didn't know it was the oldest marker in 17 criminal dialects of the outer stations. He didn't know it translated roughly as, "This one is not to be touched, not for any price, not for any reason." He didn't know that 3 separate criminal organizations had, in the past 2 years, independently come to the same conclusion about Marcus Hale. That he was either the most dangerous man on Drifton Station or the luckiest, and that in either case bothering him was bad arithmetic. He just thought someone had drawn a shape on his wall. The filtration unit's owner, a 4-armed Drassian vendor named Quillick, arrived at 3:30 bell to collect it. Marcus handed it over. Quillick pressed a payment chip into his hand, which Marcus palmed without looking at. "You check it," Quillick said. His translator bead rendered his voice as a smooth tenor, though Marcus knew the original sound was closer to 2 rocks grinding together. "You always don't check. I trust you." Quillick made a sound like gravel in a blender, which was Drassian laughter. Foolish for a human. "Probably," Marcus agreed and poured himself fresh coffee. He was halfway through it when the boy came in. He was small even for his species, which Marcus placed after a moment as Theron, a people he knew mostly from what he wished he didn't know. Blue-scaled, the scales fine as fish skin near the face and coarser along the arms. 6 fingers on each hand. Eyes set wider than a human face would allow, the irises a deep amber orange that caught the light like a slow fire. He looked about, 8 years old, though with Theron it was hard to say. They aged differently. They had grown as a species to hide how old they were, how tired they were, how afraid they were, because for most of the last century, showing any of those things had gotten them killed. This boy was not very good at hiding. He was terrified. He stood in the doorway with both sets of hands, 4 total, the secondary pair small and folded tight against his lower chest, and the Theron gesture Marcus knew meant, "Please don't hurt me." And he looked at Marcus the way small creatures looked at things that could eat them, calculating the distance to the exit while simultaneously hoping desperately that running wouldn't be necessary. In his upper right hand he held something, a sphere roughly the size of a human fist, dark gray, cracked along one side. A holosphere. Old model, consumer grade, the kind families had used 30 years ago to store recordings before the cloud networks made physical media feel quaint. This one had been cracked. Badly. The fracture ran from top to equator, deep enough that Marcus could see the inner lens array was compromised. It hadn't worked in a long time. "Come in," Marcus said. He kept his voice the way he kept his hands during delicate work. Steady. Deliberate. No sudden movements. "Coffee?" The boy shook his head. "Sit down, then. You're letting the cold in." The boy came inside. He didn't sit. He approached the workbench with the careful steps of someone crossing ice, and when he reached it, he placed the holosphere on the surface between them with both upper hands, a gesture of offering, of submission, of something precious being surrendered. Then he looked up at Marcus. "Sir." His translator bead was old, the voice rendering slightly flat, slightly delayed, like an echo of itself. "Can you fix this?" Marcus picked up the holosphere, turned it slowly. The crack was worse up close. The inner casing had warped, probably, from impact, and one of the 3 projection nodes was sheared off entirely. This was not a simple repair. "What's in it?" he asked. The boy was quiet for a moment. "My mother," he said. Her voice. She made a recording. Before. He didn't say before what. He didn't need to. Marcus set the holosphere down carefully, the way you set down something that matters to someone else. He looked at the boy. "What's your name?" "Zivek." "Marcus." "Sit down, Zivek. This is going to take a while and you look like you haven't eaten." "I'm not hungry." "I didn't ask if you were hungry. I said you look like you haven't eaten." He was already moving toward the small refrigeration unit under the far shelf. "There's a difference." The boy ate. He was in fact starving, though he ate with the contained, careful manner of someone who had learned not to let others see how badly they needed anything. He sat on the stool across the workbench from Marcus and ate a protein roll and drank water and watched Marcus work with those wide, fire-colored eyes. Marcus didn't push conversation. He had learned over the years that silence was a kind of hospitality. Some people needed to fill it. Others needed it to stay empty long enough that words could form on their own. Zivek was the second kind. He began talking about 20 minutes in, while Marcus was carefully extracting the damaged projection node with a tool that had no proper name, one he'd made himself from 2 other tools that had outlived their original purposes. He talked the way children talked when they'd been holding something too long, in pieces, out of order. The Theron had been a star-traveling people, not explorers exactly, more like wanderers, a civilization of traders and craftspeople who had for 3 centuries maintained a carefully neutral position in galactic politics by being useful to everyone and threatening to no one. That neutrality had collapsed when the Kresh Syndicate had decided the Theron's navigational knowledge was worth more extracted than traded for. It had not been a war. Wars had 2 sides. What happened to the Theron had only one. Zivek had been 4 years old. He remembered his mother's hands, the 6 fingers, the fine blue scales, and the smell of the family ship, engine oil, and something his mother cooked that he couldn't name anymore. He remembered the sounds, the breach alarms, her voice, very calm, recording something into the holosphere while she thought he was sleeping. He hadn't been sleeping. The escape pod. The syndicate patrols. The man named Doran, who was not a good man but was not a syndicate man either, who had hidden them in a cargo container for 11 days and dropped them on Drifton with 40 credits and a warning to stay underground. "Stay underground," Zivek repeated. "That's what he said. I didn't know what it meant then. I thought he meant literally." "And your mother?" Marcus asked. his eyes on his work. Long pause. She died 8 months ago. She was sick for a long time. She didn't tell me how sick. Another pause. I found the holosphere in her things after. It didn't work. It was already broken when she recorded it, I think, or it broke later. I don't know what she said. The workshop was very quiet. Marcus kept working. The node replacement took 40 minutes. Recalibrating the inner lens array took 20 more. The crack in the casing he sealed with a polymer compound that would hold better than the original material had. He worked in silence, with the same attention he gave everything, total, unhurried, as if this were the only thing in the universe that needed doing right now, because right now, it was. When he was finished, he set the holosphere on the workbench, between them. "Ready?" he said. Zivek looked at it. His secondary hands were folded against his chest again. "What if she says something I can't fix?" he asked. Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Then you'll know what she said." "That's not nothing, Zivek. That's actually everything." The boy reached out and pressed the activation point. The holosphere hummed. The projection node flickered once, twice. Marcus held his breath. And then a figure appeared above the device, pale blue and translucent, the size of Marcus's palm, rendered imperfectly by old technology, but unmistakably a Theran woman. Fine-scaled, six-fingered. A face that looked like Zivek's would look in 30 years. She spoke. Marcus did not understand Theran. He heard the cadence of it. Something that moved like music through minor keys, something with edges and warmth in equal measure. He watched Zivek's face. He watched the boy become undone and then, slowly, become put back together. The recording lasted 4 minutes. When it ended, the figure dissolved. The holosphere sat quiet on the workbench, its work complete, its long wait finished. Zivek was not crying. His face was wet, but there was something in his expression that hadn't been there before. Something settled. Something that had been floating had at last found ground. "She said she was proud of me," he said. "She said I would know what to do." He wiped his face with the back of his upper hand. "She said home isn't a place. She said, it's a—" He paused, working for the translation. "A shape that you carry." Marcus nodded. Zivek looked at the holosphere for a long moment. Then he looked up at the ceiling of the workshop where Marcus had, years ago, installed a lighting strip that cast a warm golden glow. Not because it was practical, but because cold white light made everything feel like an examination. "Sir," the boy said, "can you fix a broken sky?" Marcus looked up with him. "What do you mean?" "My mother said home had 3 sons. Not 1. 3. And in the morning, when they all rose together, the sky turned a color she couldn't describe. She said it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen." He lowered his eyes. "I've never seen it. I was too small, and now—" He stopped, started again. "I just want to know what it looked like. Is that a thing you can fix?" The workshop door opened. The man who stood there was not looking for repairs. He was tall, broad, wearing the graphite gray uniform of the Kresh Syndicate's Enforcement Division. Not the kind of man who made apologies or knocked before entering. His name was Commander Vex Draylor, and Marcus had never seen him before, but he recognized the type with the same certainty with which he recognized a cracked bearing or a burnt-out fuse. Something broken, wearing an authority it hadn't earned. Draylor's eyes went to the boy. "There you are," he said. Zivek went absolutely still. His secondary hands pressed flat against his chest. Marcus set down his tools. Slowly, carefully. He stood up. The thing about Marcus Hale was that he didn't raise his voice. He had learned, in 21 years of deep space combat engineering across 4 active war zones and 3 classified operations that officially hadn't happened, that raising your voice was what people did when they needed the other person to be afraid of them. And Marcus had stopped needing that a long time ago. He stepped around the workbench. He placed himself between Commander Draylor and Zivek with the same deliberate calm with which he'd moved all his life. No performance in it, no posturing, just a body occupying a space because it had decided to. "Can I help you?" he said. Draylor looked at him the way the powerful look at the inconvenient. A flicker of assessment, a conclusion drawn fast and filed under. Not a problem. Step aside. That asset belongs to the syndicate. He produced a data chip and held it up. I have documentation. The boy's labor contract was assumed from his deceased guardian under Outer Station Commerce Code, Article. You can stop there, Marcus said. Draylor stopped. Not because he was told to. He wasn't the kind of man who responded to being told. But because something in Marcus's voice had changed. Not louder. Not harder, exactly. Just different. The way a temperature drop is different. Noticeable only when you realize the air has changed. I'm going to explain something to you, Marcus said. And I'd like you to listen carefully because I'm only going to explain it once, and what happens after that depends a great deal on how well you heard it. Draylor's eyes narrowed. His hand moved toward his coat. Don't, Marcus said. Just the one word. The hand stopped. Good. Now. Marcus folded his arms. The boy is not an asset. He is not property. He is not covered under any commerce code that has ever been written or ever will be written. Because commerce codes exist to regulate the exchange of things, and he is not a thing. He is 8 years old. His mother just spoke to him for the first time since she died, and you walked into my shop. My shop. Where I have spent 11 years repairing things for people who need them repaired, without asking what they could give me in return, because that is what I do. He paused. You picked the wrong morning. Draylor laughed. It was the kind of laugh that powerful men use to remind others of the gap between them. Old man, do you have any idea? 21 years, 7th Rapid Engineering Corps, Marcus said. Not loudly, just informatively. 14 combat deployments. 3 of them were classified. 2 of them I still can't tell you about. Not because I'm obligated to keep the secret, but because the governments that classified them no longer exist. I designed demolition systems for fortified orbital stations. I held a bulkhead door closed, with my body for 6 hours while 43 people evacuated behind me. I have been in the kind of situations that people write words like impossible and unsurvivable about, and I am standing here telling you about them, which should tell you something. The laugh had faded. Draylor was still in the doorway, but he was standing differently now. The way people stood when they were recalculating. I am 51 years old, Marcus continued. I am tired and I drink too much coffee and my knees hurt in the cold. I am not who I was. But I will tell you something important about humans, Commander. We don't get angry the way other species do. We don't roar. We don't flash our colors. When a human gets truly, deeply angry, we get quiet. He looked at Draylor. I am very quiet right now. The silence that followed had a weight to it. Draylor opened his mouth. He closed it. His eyes moved around the workshop. Not strategically, not the way soldiers swept rooms, but the way men looked when they were looking for something to anchor them, something to tell them how to read a situation that had stopped behaving the way situations were supposed to behave. His gaze landed on the workbench, on the small collection of tools, on the half-finished components and the coils of wire and the soldering iron, and then in the corner partially covered by a canvas tarp on something that was not a repair project, something that looked to someone who knew what they were looking at, like the internal components of a station-grade electromagnetic pulse emitter, painstakingly disassembled and very deliberately rearranged. Draylor was, for all his faults, someone who knew what he was looking at. That's, he started. Registered, Marcus said. Station maintenance equipment. I have the authorization paperwork here. He tapped a shelf without looking at it. I also have 17 other authorizations for 17 other pieces of station maintenance equipment distributed across Level 7. All registered. All documented. All entirely legitimate. Pause. It would be a terrible shame if several pieces of legitimate maintenance equipment malfunctioned simultaneously in this corridor. Draylor stared at him. Behind Draylor, something changed. In the corridor, shadows moved. Marcus watched the commander's shoulders stiffen as he became aware, slowly then all at once, that the corridor was no longer empty. Shapes had collected behind him. A Dracian with forearms crossed. Two Velkan traders whose species did not have faces you could read but whose posture communicated clearly. An old woman from the station's deepest level whose name Marcus didn't know but who came in every week for hot coffee and sometimes sat for hours without saying anything. None of them were armed. That he could see. None of them stepped forward. None of them spoke. They just stood there. Draylor turned back to Marcus. Something had shifted in his expression. Not fear exactly, because men like Draylor had trained themselves out of fear. Something more like the recognition that the math had changed, that the variables were different than he'd accounted for, and that running new numbers in the field, in real time, with this many unknowns, was a losing exercise. "This isn't finished," he said. "It is, actually," Marcus replied. "But you're welcome to have a different opinion. That's your right. Have a good morning, Commander." For a long moment, Draylor stood in the doorway. Then he left. The corridor was silent. Then the shapes in it dispersed, quietly, without drama, the way water disperses when the stone that broke it is removed. The old woman was the last to go. She paused, looked at Marcus, and gave him a slow nod that communicated something he couldn't entirely read. Then she turned and walked away. Marcus let out a slow breath. He turned back to the workbench. Zivek was standing exactly where he'd been, secondary hands pressed to his chest, staring at Marcus with those wide amber-orange eyes. "He'll come back," the boy said. "Maybe," Marcus said. "Sit down. There's something I need to do, and it's going to take most of the day." It took 3 days. Marcus Hale had been, in his previous life, many things. A soldier, an engineer, a man who built instruments of war and then spent a decade and a half trying to make peace with the things instruments of war were used for. He had not, until Drifton, been a man who did paperwork, trying to make peace with the things instruments of war were used for. He had not, until Drifton, been a man who did paperwork. But he had learned. Outer Station Legal Code was a sprawling, contradictory, intentionally impenetrable document that 11 different jurisdictions had contributed to over 2 centuries, none of them communicating with the others, all of them writing with the specific intent of making things difficult for anyone who wasn't already powerful. Marcus had spent 4 years learning it, because 4 years ago, a family in Level 3 had been facing eviction under a clause that didn't legally apply to their situation, and nobody on the station had understood the code well enough to say so. He'd fixed that. He'd also fixed the 6 situations that came after it, and the 9 that came after those. He spent 3 days filing. Temporary guardian designation under unaccompanied minor statute. Emergency humanitarian residency claim. Syndicate labor contract dispute. Improper origin declaration. He cross-referenced Article 7 of the Outer Commerce Accords with Amendment 14 of the Drifton Station Residency Charter with a subclause in the Galactic Child Welfare Agreement that the syndicate had co-signed 40 years ago and clearly forgotten about. He filed everything 3 times, in 3 different registries, with timestamps. On the evening of the 3rd day, a syndicate legal representative sent a communication demanding the contracts be honored. Marcus sent back a 47-page response that was, technically and legally, the most thorough thing he had ever written. He never heard from them again. Zivek stayed. Not officially, at first. And then officially, once the paperwork resolved itself, the way good paperwork eventually did. Slowly and then all at once. He turned out to be handy. Not with soldering irons or polymer sealants, at least not yet, but with organization, which was a thing Marcus had never been and had never pretended to be. Zivek categorized the parts bins by component type and then by frequency of use, and then created a labeling system that Marcus initially resisted and then could not imagine working without. He also had a memory for faces. He knew every person who came through the door after meeting them once, knew what they'd brought in last time, knew what they usually needed, knew when they were having a harder week than usual. "You're better with people than I am," Marcus told him once. "You're better with things than I am," Zivek replied. "Maybe that's why it works." It did seem to work. The project took Marcus 6 weeks. He worked on it in the hours after Zivek was asleep, in the space above the workshop's ceiling panels where he'd long ago built a secondary workspace for things he wanted to work on without explaining himself. He pulled components from 3 different decommissioned holoprojectors, rewired a defunct atmospheric lighting array, and wrote the rendering algorithm himself over several sleepless nights, using a star atlas he'd ordered from an archivist on Station Kel who specialized in pre-syndicate records. The Theran homeworld, its orbital position, its atmospheric composition, its 3 suns, one large and warm and yellow-white, one smaller and blue-white and sharp, one red giant distant, more presence than light, a warmth felt rather than seen. The color they made together when they rose, which the archivist's records described in 17 different Theran words, none of which translated perfectly. Marcus did the best he could. On a morning 6 weeks after Zivek had first walked through the door, Marcus told him there was something in the workshop he wanted to show him. He led the boy inside, sat him on the stool by the workbench and said, "Close your eyes for a second." Zivek gave him the look he'd developed for Marcus's more unusual requests, skeptical, patient, ultimately willing. He closed his eyes. Marcus activated the system. The ceiling dissolved. Not literally. The panels were still there. The structure was sound. Nothing had been removed or altered in any way that would concern a station inspector. But the panels now displayed a sky. A rendered sky, imperfect by any astronomical measure, the light not quite identical to what 3 specific suns would produce, the horizon slightly wrong, the transition from the morning dark to the triple rise slower than it would have been in reality. But the color was there. Marcus had found it eventually. In an old Theran poem preserved in the archive, there was a description, not of the color itself, which defied description, but of what it made people feel. Like being forgiven, the poem said, for everything you hadn't done yet. He'd built toward that feeling. He wasn't sure he'd gotten there. He wasn't sure a human could. He watched Zivek open his eyes. The boy was quiet for a long time. His secondary hands unfolded from his chest, slowly, as if they'd been folded there so long they'd forgotten how to open, and rested at his sides. She said it turned a color she couldn't describe, he said finally. Yeah, Marcus said. You found it. I found something like it. The real one would be better. Zivek looked at the sky for another long moment. It's not home, he said. Marcus put a hand on his shoulder. Not yet, he said. The triple light moved slowly across the ceiling of Second Chance's repair, warm and blue-white and distant red all at once, and Marcus Hale, last human on Drifton Station, repairman of broken things, drank his coffee, and watched a boy who had no sky find one, imperfect, constructed, stubbornly real, overhead. The sign outside still hung crooked. We fix everything. It was, Marcus had come to understand, not a boast. It was a promise. But he had learned, Outer Station Legal Code was a sprawling, contradictory, intentionally impenetrable document that 11 different jurisdictions had contributed to over 2 centuries, none of them communicating with the others, all of them writing with the specific intent of making things difficult for anyone who wasn't already powerful. Marcus had spent 4 years learning it because 4 years ago, a family in Level 3 had been facing eviction under a clause that didn't legally apply to their situation, and nobody on the station had understood the code well enough to say so. He'd fix that. He'd also fix the 6 situations that came after it, and the 9 that came after those. He spent 3 days filing. Temporary guardian designation under unaccompanied minor statute, emergency humanitarian residency claim, syndicate labor contract dispute, improper origin declaration. He cross-referenced Article 7 of the Outer Commerce Accords with Amendment 14 of the Drifton Station Residency Charter, with a subclause in the Galactic Child Welfare Agreement that the syndicate had co-signed 40 years ago and clearly forgotten about. He filed everything 3 times, in 3 different registries, with timestamps. On the evening of the 3rd day, a syndicate legal representative sent a communication demanding the contracts be honored. Marcus sent back a 47-page response that was, technically and legally, the most thorough thing he had ever written. He never heard from them again. Zivek stayed, not officially at first, and then officially once the paperwork resolved itself the way good paperwork eventually did, slowly and then all at once. He turned out to be handy, not with soldering irons or polymer sealants, at least not yet, but with organization, which was a thing Marcus had never been and had never pretended to be. Zivek categorized the parts bins by component type, and then by frequency of use, and then created a labeling system that Marcus initially resisted, and then could not imagine working without. He also had a memory for faces. He knew every person who came through the door after meeting them once, knew what they'd brought in last time, knew what they usually needed, knew when they were having a harder week than usual. "You're better with people than I am," Marcus told him once. "You're better with things than I am," Zivek replied. "Maybe that's why it works." It did seem to work. The project took Marcus 6 weeks. He worked on it in the hours after Zivek was asleep, in the space above the workshop's ceiling panels where he'd long ago built a secondary workspace for things he wanted to work on without explaining himself. He pulled components from 3 different decommissioned holoprojectors, rewired a defunct atmospheric lighting array, and wrote the rendering algorithm himself over several sleepless nights, using a star atlas he'd ordered from an archivist on Station Kell who specialized in pre-syndicate records. The Theran homeworld, its orbital position, its atmospheric composition, its 3 suns, one large and warm and yellow-white, one smaller and blue-white and sharp, one red giant distant, more presence than light, a warmth felt rather than seen. The color they made together when they rose, which the archivist's records described in 17 different Theran words, none of which translated perfectly. Marcus did the best he could. On a morning 6 weeks after Zivek had first walked through the door, Marcus told him there was something in the workshop he wanted to show him. He led the boy inside, sat him on the stool by the workbench and said, "Close your eyes for a second." Zivek gave him the look he'd developed for Marcus's more unusual requests, skeptical, patient, ultimately willing. He closed his eyes. Marcus activated the system. The ceiling dissolved. Not literally. The panels were still there. The structure was sound. Nothing had been removed or altered in any way that would concern a station inspector. But the panels now displayed a sky. A rendered sky, imperfect by any astronomical measure, the light not quite identical to what 3 specific suns would produce, the horizon slightly wrong, the transition from the morning dark to the triple